The sterile chill of the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, always got to me. It wasn't the cold itself, not really. It was the absolute, suffocating stillness that clung to the air, a heavy blanket woven from disinfectant, and the ghosts of countless lives that had passed through this place, not always on the way to recovery. Another Tuesday, another body. The usual symphony of flashing blue and red lights had long since faded, leaving only the low hum of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled clang of metal on metal. I pushed open the heavy steel door, the squeal protesting my intrusion. The scene inside was, as always, stark. The air was thick with that metallic tang, overlaid with something else, something faintly sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit. It was a smell I'd learned to associate with the end of things. The attending medical examiner, a woman whose name I'd never bothered to learn beyond the me, stood hunched over the examination table. She looked up as I entered, her expression a practiced mask of professional detachment. His eyes, however, held a flicker of something else, something that mirrored the unease settling in my gut. "Dean," he acknowledged, his voice flat. "Took your time." "Traffic," I lied, though the truth was I'd lingered at the precinct, staring at the precinct board, willing the details of that case to rearrange themselves into something I'd missed, something I could have done differently. "What have we got?" She gestured with a gloved hand towards the sheet-draped form on the table. "Male, mid-30s maybe, no identification. Looks like a clean break, though, no obvious struggle." I walked closer, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The me pulled back the sheet, revealing a man whose stillness was absolute. His skin had a waxy pallor, and his eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling with a vacant, unseeing gaze. But it wasn't the lifelessness that stopped me. It was the arrangement. His arms were outstretched, palms up, as if in supplication. His legs were together, perfectly straight, and around his neck, a single, delicate strand of ivy woven with unnerving precision. It wasn't just a random detail, it was deliberate. Every leaf, every tendril placed with an almost artistic, if morbid, care. My breath hitched. I'd seen this before. Not this exact configuration, not precisely, but the feeling of it, the staged tableau. "Anything else?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. The me shook her head. "Nothing obvious, no defensive wounds, no signs of forced entry at his apartment. We did a preliminary sweep, clean as a whistle, except for this." She pointed to a small, tarnished silver locket clutched in the man's left hand. I leaned in, my gaze fixed on the locket. It was old, ornate, with a faded floral pattern etched into its surface. I reached for my evidence kit, my movements slow, deliberate. This was it. As I carefully pried open the locket with a specialized tool, my gloved fingers felt suddenly clumsy, thick. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, were two miniature portraits. On one side, a woman, her smile soft, her eyes kind. This was a visceral, physical reaction. The boy in the portrait. I knew that face. I'd seen it in grainy photographs, in desperate pleas on missing person flyers. I'd stared at it for weeks, months, years even, until the edges of his image had blurred in my mind, a constant, gnawing reminder of my failure. The woman beside him, he was the reason he was missing. Her disappearance had been the start of it all, a decade ago. She'd vanished without a trace, and shortly after so had her son. "I all right?" The me voice, sharp with concern, cut through the fog in my head. I forced myself to look away from the tiny faces to focus on the present. But the present had just slammed into the past with the force of a freight train. The ivy, the staged body, the locket, it wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. This was a message, a taunt. "It's familiar," I managed to say, my gaze sweeping over the room, over the lifeless man, over the meticulously placed ivy. "I think I've seen this before." The me eyebrows drew together. "Seen what before, Dean? This particular arrangement?" I didn't answer, my mind racing, piecing together fragments of a forgotten nightmare. It was the icy grip of a past I thought I'd buried, now clawing its way back to the surface. And this killer, whoever they were, knew it. They knew me. And they were playing a game. A game I was now forced to play, whether I wanted to or not. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something heavy and cloying, like old dust and regret. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, dancing over stained linoleum and stacked metal trays. The attendant, a pale man with perpetually damp hands, had already prepped the room, his movements efficient, almost rehearsed. He gestured towards the stainless steel table, a silent invitation. "He's ready," the attendant murmured, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to disturb the stillness. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the sheet draped over the form on the table. It was a familiar sight, a tableau I'd witnessed countless times, yet this one felt different. A knot tightened in my gut, a premonition that had been brewing since the initial call. The victim's profile, the peculiar details of the scene, they were too precise, too deliberate. With a deep breath, I reached out and pulled back the sheet. My breath hitched. It was him. Not the same, of course, but the configuration, the arrangement of the body, the specific objects placed around him. It was a carbon copy. A chilling echo from a case I'd carried for 15 years. And the centerpiece of each tableau always was a single, wilting white rose. There it was, tucked just beneath the victim's chin. A stark white rose, its petals already beginning to brown at the edges. Each photograph felt like a betrayal, a concession to the past I'd fought so hard to outrun. "Anything unusual, sir?" the attendant asked, his eyes wide, fixed on my face. I didn't look at him. "Just documenting," I said, my voice rougher than I intended. I ran a gloved finger over the victim's skin, noting the faint bruising around the wrists, the telltale signs of restraint. The same pattern, always the same. This wasn't a copycat. This was him, back, or someone who knew him intimately, someone who knew me. I moved around the table, my eyes scanning every detail. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, but there was no fear in them. Only a profound stillness, as if he'd accepted his fate with unnerving calm. Then I saw it. Tucked into the breast pocket of the victim's suit, peeking out from behind the lapel, was a small, folded piece of paper. It was a calling card, a deliberate addition. "What's this?" I asked, my voice low, directed more at myself than the attendant. I carefully extracted the paper with tweezers, my movements precise, deliberate. Unfolding, it revealed a single, elegant symbol drawn in black ink. It was a stylized raven, its wings spread wide. I knew that symbol. Letters filled with cryptic riddles and veiled threats, always signed with that raven. I dismissed them as the ramblings of a disturbed individual, a desperate attempt to gain notoriety. Now, seeing it here, on this victim, in this meticulously recreated scene, it felt like a direct message, a taunt. My mind flashed back to the original case files, the countless hours spent poring over details, the dead ends, the gnawing frustration. I remembered the press conferences, the pressure, the gnawing feeling that I was always one step behind. This killer wasn't just recreating the past, he was performing it. And he was doing it for me. He knew I'd be here. He knew I'd recognize the signs. "Sir," the attendant prompted again, his voice laced with concern. I looked at him, my eyes finally meeting his. "Bag this," I said, handing him the folded paper and the rose. "Every fiber, every speck of dust, I want it all." As the attendant carefully placed the items into evidence bags, I circled the table again, my gaze sweeping over the victim's face. There was a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his lips. It was a smile that spoke of a secret, a shared understanding. And then I saw it, etched faintly into the victim's left palm, almost invisible unless the light caught it just right. A tiny, perfectly formed raven mirroring the symbol on the paper. This was no accident. This was a deliberate, calculated move, a game, and I was the unwilling player. I had to find out who this was and why now. The hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, suddenly felt like a trap sprung shut. The attendant, a young man with perpetually worried eyes, finished bagging the last of the personal effects from the table. I watched him, my own mind replaying the victim's expression, that faint smile. It was a ghost from another time, another scene, a cold case, the one that still kept me up at night. "Anything else, sir?" the attendant asked, his voice a low murmur in the sterile quiet of the hospital basement. "Emergency autopsy requested." I shook my head, my gaze still fixed on the vacant stare of the victim. "No, that's it for now." I watched him leave, the squeak of his shoes echoing down the tiled corridor. The silence that descended felt heavy, charged. This wasn't just another body on a slab. This was a message. I walked over to the stainless steel table, running a gloved hand along its cool surface. The air here was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something coppery and ancient. The victim, a man in his late 30s, lay still under the harsh glare of the overhead lights. His body was meticulously arranged, almost posed. The same deliberate placement I'd seen before, years ago. My fingers traced the faint outline of a symbol etched onto the victim's palm. It was a simple geometric pattern, almost like a stylized sun. I'd seen it before, on the wrist of the victim in the Miller case. I dismissed it then, a random mark, a scar. Now it felt like a brand, a signature. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through old case files. The Miller file was buried deep, a digital relic I rarely revisited. The photos were grainy, the notes faded, but the details, they were seared into my memory. The same meticulous staging, the same unsettling calm on the victim's face, and that symbol. It was there, a faint smudge on the back of the victim's hand in one of the crime scene photos. I'd never connected it. Until now, a wave of nausea washed over me. How could I have missed this? How could I have let this killer slip through my fingers all those years ago? The attendant's worried eyes flashed in my mind. He'd seen the smile. He'd noticed the details, but he was just an attendant. I was the investigator, the one who was supposed to see everything. I needed more. I needed to go back to the beginning. I signaled to a technician setting up equipment in the corner. I need access to the Miller case files, I said, my voice rougher than I intended. Everything. Photos, reports, witness statements, the whole damn thing. The technician nodded, already tapping away on a secure terminal. Give me a few minutes, sir. It's an old one. While I waited, I walked the perimeter of the autopsy suite again. But tonight it felt like a stage. I paused by a discarded surgical instrument, its steel glinting. The killer was careful, precise. They knew what they were doing. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a performance. The technician returned, a portable drive in his hand. Got it, sir, all digitized. I took the drive, my fingers brushing against its cool plastic. This was it, the key. I plugged it into my laptop, the screen flickering to life. The Miller file opened, a digital ghost from my past. I started with the crime scene photos, my eyes scanning each detail, comparing them to what I was seeing now. The victim's position, the arrangement of objects, the subtle, almost imperceptible differences. The killer wasn't just replicating the past, they were refining it, improving, making it their own. Then I found it, a detail I'd overlooked in my initial investigation. It was intricately detailed, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. I remembered seeing it then, but hadn't paid it much mind. Just another piece of clutter. I zoomed in on the photo, my breath catching in my throat. On the underside of the bird's left wing, barely visible, was a tiny inscription. It was too small to read in the grainy photo, but I knew what it would say. I felt it in my gut. I pulled up the current crime scene photos on my laptop, scrolling to the victim's hands. The attendant had bagged them, but I'd taken detailed shots before they were removed. I found the photo of the victim's left hand, palm up. And there it was, the symbol. But this time, it wasn't just a symbol. It was part of a larger design. And within the design, almost invisible, was a single, tiny, carved wooden bird. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a copycat. This was him, the Miller killer. He was back, and he was playing with me. I slammed my laptop shut, the sound echoing in the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. The tension in the room ratcheted up, a palpable thing. I looked at the victim on the table, his serene expression now a mocking grin. He knew I was here. He knew I was watching. I walked over to the body, my gaze fixed on the victim's left hand. The symbol was clear, stark against his pale skin, and within it the tiny, almost invisible carved bird. I reached out, my gloved finger hovering over the inscription. It was real. This was no hallucination. This was a direct taunt. If the killer was leaving these birds, these symbols, what was the next step? What was the end game? This time I wouldn't. I couldn't. I turned to the technician, my voice firm. I need a full forensic sweep of this room, every inch, and I want a detailed analysis of that symbol and the carving on the bird. I want to know its origin, its meaning, everything. The technician, sensing the shift in my demeanor, nodded grimly. Understood, sir. As he got to work, I pulled out my notepad, my hand shaking slightly. I started sketching the symbol, then the bird. I needed to document everything, every detail, every nuance. The killer was taunting me, yes, but they were also giving me clues, and I was going to follow them, no matter where they led, even if it meant digging up the ghosts of my past. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with the metallic tang of blood and something else, something cloying and sweet like overripe fruit. I could feel the damp seeping through the soles of my worn-out shoes. It wasn't the sterile, clean smell I usually associated with my work. But then again, nothing about this case was usual. I knelt beside the table, the harsh fluorescent lights overhead glinting off the instruments laid out with chilling precision. The victim, a young woman, lay still, her eyes wide open, staring at a ceiling I couldn't bring myself to look at. The same symbol from the previous scene was etched into her skin, a stark, black silhouette against her pale flesh. This was no random act of violence. This was a message, and the messenger was getting bolder. "Anything, Dean?" the detective asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. He'd seen the symbol too, the same flicker of recognition, then unease that had crossed my own face. He knew this wasn't just another assignment for me. I didn't look up. "The positioning of the ligature marks," I murmured, my gloved fingers tracing the faint impressions on the victim's neck. "It's precise, almost artistic, and the bird is not just a drawing, is it? It's a specific species." I'd spent hours poring over ornithology books back in my office, trying to place the stylized wings, the sharp beak. The detective shifted his weight. "You think it's a signature?" "More than that," I said, my voice tight. "It's a boast. He's showing off, and he's doing it with the same flair as the one from 15 years ago." My gut twisted. 15 years. 15 years of unanswered questions, of sleepless nights replaying fragments of evidence that never quite fit. And now this. This echo, this cruel imitation, or worse, the original back from the dead. I pulled out my notepad, flipping to a fresh page. The symbol, the bird. The initial shark had worn off, replaced by a grim determination. This wasn't just about solving a murder. It was about closing a chapter of my own life that had been left frustratingly, agonizingly open. "The victim," I said, looking at the detective. "Who was she?" "Sarah Jenkins, 26, worked at a bookstore downtown. No priors, no known enemies, lived alone." He paused. "Her landlord found her when she didn't show up for work, said the door was unlocked." Unlocked. Another detail. Another intentional omission. A killer who was meticulous enough to stage a ritualistic murder was careless enough to leave a door unlocked. It didn't fit. Unless the unlocked door was part of the message, an invitation, a challenge. I continued my examination, documenting every bruise, every contusion, every trace of foreign material. The medical examiner was efficient, his movements practiced, but even he seemed to sense the weight of the atmosphere in the room. Later, back in my cramped office, the scent of stale coffee and old paper clinging to the walls, I spread out the photographs and my sketches, the ligature marks. I traced the outlines of the symbol from the old file, then overlaid it with the new one. Identical, down to the smallest flourish. "It's him," I breathed, the words catching in my throat. Or at least it was someone who knew him, someone who had studied him, someone who was trying to be him. I picked up the phone and called the precinct. "I need everything we have on the Crimson Mark case," I said, using the old, forgotten moniker. "Every scrap of paper, every witness statement, every photograph. I need it all now." Hours blurred into a haze of dust motes dancing in the beam of my desk lamp. I was deep in the archives, the air thick with the scent of decaying paper, when I found it. A forgotten interview, buried in a box of peripheral evidence. A homeless man, a witness who had been dismissed at the time as unreliable, had mentioned seeing someone near the scene of the first murder. He described a distinctive limp, a gait that was like a broken clock. He'd also mentioned a peculiar habit. The man he saw would tap his fingers against any hard surface, a rhythmic, almost musical sound. Tap, tap, tappity tap, 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 tappity tap. A broken clock, a rhythmic tapping. It wasn't much, but it was something. I cross-referenced the old case file with missing persons reports, with individuals who had a history of violence, with anyone who fit even a vague description. Then, a name surfaced. A man who had been questioned briefly in connection with the first murder, but had an alibi that, while shaky, had held up at the time. He'd been released. His name was irrelevant. What mattered was his physical description. He had a pronounced limp, the result of an old industrial accident, and according to the report, he had a nervous tic. He would incessantly tap his fingers against any available surface. My heart started to beat a little faster. This was it. This was the connection. I started digging into his current whereabouts, his associates, his movements. As I was piecing it together, a small, folded piece of paper caught my eye. It had been tucked inside the old witness statement, almost as an afterthought. I unfolded it carefully. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was a direct threat. And the location of that threat, the implication, was staring me right in the face. The next victim. It wasn't a random guess. It was a deliberate, calculated lure. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was walking right into it. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung thick and still, smelling of disinfectant and something metallic I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the usual sterile scent of a precinct evidence larker. This place was functional, utilitarian, a stark contrast to the chaotic beauty of a crime scene. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, sterile shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe with every movement. I stood by the stainless steel table, my gaze fixed on the sheet covering the body. My colleague, a sharp-eyed technician I'd worked with for years, was methodically bagging and tagging. Each zip of a plastic bag echoed in the quiet space, a tiny punctuation mark in a sentence I was still struggling to read. "Anything, Dean." The technician's voice was low, a professional murmur that didn't betray any curiosity about my grim expression. They'd seen it all, or so I thought. I shook my head, my jaw tight. "Not yet, just keep doing your thing." The victim, a young woman barely out of her teens. Her face, what I'd seen of it before the sheet was placed, was pale, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to have frozen on her features. The staging, though, that's what gnawed at me. The way the scene had been meticulously arranged, the one that had haunted my sleep for a decade. The implication of the location, the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, wasn't just a random choice. It was a message, a deliberate, calculated move. The killer wasn't just replicating the past, they were escalating. They were bringing the hunt into my world, into my comfort zone, and then twisting it into something I couldn't ignore. My colleague paused, holding up a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "Found this tucked inside him jacket pocket, Dean. Looks old." I took it, turning it over in my gloved hand. The wood was smooth, worn by time and countless touches. The craftsmanship was exquisite, almost unnervingly delicate. And then it hit me, not this exact bird, but the style. The same distinctive knotwork carved into the base of the altar at the first scene. Where was it exactly? My voice was a low growl, barely audible. Right there. The technician pointed to a small breast pocket. Like he was meant to be found with it. Meant to be found. The phrase hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't just about mirroring the past. It was about communicating with me. This killer was playing a game, and I was the unwilling pawn. I walked over to the evidence table, my mind racing. The arrangement of the body, the specific items left behind, the choice of a public, yet secluded, location, it all pointed to a sophisticated understanding of my investigative methods. They knew what I looked for. They knew what would trigger my memories. Run this bird through every database we have, cross-reference it with any known artisan groups, historical societies, anything. I instructed the technician, my voice regaining some of its usual authority, though an undercurrent of unease remained. As they worked, I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact of a retired detective, a man who had mentored me in my early days. He'd retired after a brutal case, a case that had broken him. I'd always scoffed. I was Dean. I could handle it. But this felt different. This felt personal. The similarities were too many to be a coincidence. The killer was showing me exactly what they wanted me to see. They wanted me to remember. They wanted me to feel the same helplessness I'd felt all those years ago. A sharp beep from the technician's workstation jolted me from my thoughts. "Dean, you're not going to like this." I walked over, my stomach tightening. On the screen, a grainy photograph appeared. It was a security camera still, taken from a distance, but the figure was unmistakable, the same silhouette that had haunted my nightmares. That's impossible, I stammered, the words catching in my throat. The figure in the photograph was walking away from the scene just before the initial call came in. This killer wasn't just replicating the past, they were living it, breathing it, making it anew. My colleague looked at me, his brow furrowed. "You know this person, Dean?" I couldn't answer. The weight of the past, of my failure to solve that first case, crashed down on me with renewed force. It wasn't just a ghost anymore. It was a predator, and they were still out there, taunting me with every meticulously placed clue. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. This wasn't just about justice for the victims, it was about redemption for me. But how could I redeem myself when the killer was always one step ahead, always one move ahead, always one memory ahead? I needed help. I needed someone who wasn't blinded by the ghosts of the past. I needed to stop being so damn stubborn. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, hung thick and metallic, a familiar stench I'd tried to outrun for years. This wasn't just any basement, it was the basement. The one where my first real failure had been laid out on a slab, under the unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. Now, here I was again, the same sterile chill seeping into my bones, but this time, the body wasn't the only thing that felt wrong. Miller stood beside me, his usual gruffness softened by a shared understanding. He'd seen the flicker in my eyes, the way my jaw tightened when the attendant mentioned the specific location. We'd been working the recent scene, the one that mirrored the cold case, for the better part of 2 days. Every detail, from the precise angle of the ligature marks to the symbolic placement of the victim's hands, screamed the same signature. And it wasn't just a signature, it was a message. "They're calling this one in," Miller's voice, low and gravelly, cut through the hum of the ventilation system. "Victim's name is Elena Vance, art restorer. He was found by her landlord an hour ago." Elena Vance, the name snagged on something in my memory. I dismissed it as background noise then, too focused on the immediate horror. Now it clicked into place with a sickening lurch. "Did they say? Where?" I asked, my voice rougher than I intended. The attendant, a young man with a pale face and nervous eyes, cleared his throat. "In her studio, sir, downtown, near the old gallery district." My gut clenched. The old gallery district. The same kind of solitary artist, the same quiet life. This wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate escalation. The killer wasn't just mimicking the past. They were actively hunting for new prey, using the old case as a blueprint. "Miller," I said, turning to my colleague. "This is it. This is our guy. He's not just playing games, he's building something." Miller nodded. He's sharp. "I felt it too, Dean. This isn't random, it's personal." We moved through the maze of corridors, the scent of disinfectant and something else, something earthy, like damp concrete growing stronger. The autopsy suite was a stark, utilitarian space. The attendant gestured towards the stainless steel table. Elena Vance lay there, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The stillness was profound, a terrifying contrast to the vibrant life I imagined she'd led. The ligature marks were there, subtle but distinct, just as I remembered. But there was something else, something on her right wrist, almost hidden beneath the cuff of her silk blouse. "Hold on," I said, leaning closer. The medical examiner paused, his instruments hovering. I gently pulled back the fabric. A small, intricate tattoo, a stylized raven, its wings outstretched. My breath hitched. It had been dismissed as a personal memento, nothing more. But now, with Elena Vance and her raven, a pattern was emerging, a macabre bestiary of sorts. "Ravens," Miller murmured, looking at me. "You think?" "I think our killer is leaving us breadcrumbs," I said, my voice tight. "And they're escalating. Sparrow, then raven. What's next? A hawk? An eagle?" The implication hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about revenge or a twisted sense of justice. This was a progression, a hunt. And if the pattern held, Elena Vance was just the latest in a series. "We need to find out who else she might have known in the art world," Miller said, pulling out his phone. "Anyone she might have had contact with recently, especially anyone with an interest in birds." The irony wasn't lost on me. We were hunting a killer who was using art as his canvas, his victims as his subjects, and now avian symbolism as his twisted signature. As Miller began making calls, I found myself staring at Alina Vance's tattoo, the black ink stark against her pale skin. And then it hit me. The obscure Renaissance piece Alina Vance had been restoring, the patron who had commissioned it. I'd seen the name on a faded invoice at the original crime scene, a name I'd dismissed as irrelevant at the time. The one who commissioned the restoration. I think I know who it is. Miller looked up from his phone, his brow furrowed. Who? I didn't answer immediately. I had to be sure. There, tucked away in a corner of a desk, a receipt, a name scrawled in elegant, looping script. Arthur Finch, I said, the name feeling alien on my tongue. The patron, Arthur Finch. Miller's eyes widened. Finch, like a bird. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was the killer staring us in the face, taunting us with his twisted game. And if Arthur Finch was the patron, and he was also the killer, then his next target would likely be someone connected to him, someone who fit the emerging avian theme. We need to find Arthur Finch, I said, my voice firm, all doubt replaced by a grim determination. And we need to find him before he completes his flark. The weight of the past was still there, but now it was a fuel driving me forward. This time I wouldn't let him get away. This time I would catch him. The air in the hospital basement, emergency autopsy requested, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something cloying and acrid that made my gut clench. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a weak, sickly tune, casting long, distorted shadows across the tiled floor. My boots echoed with each deliberate step, a lonely sound in the cavernous space. They'd wheeled the latest victim in an hour ago, another young woman. Another tableau designed to rip open old wounds. This one was worse. The staging was almost identical to the Miller case, the one that had haunted my sleep for 15 years. The precise arrangement of the objects, the symbolic placement of the victim's hands, the faint scent of lavender, it was a carbon copy. My colleagues, a pair of grim-faced technicians, worked with a practiced, almost numb efficiency, their movements economical under the harsh glare. I watched them, my own hands shoved deep into my pockets, feeling the familiar phantom weight of my old camera. Anything, Dean? The lead technician asked, his voice raspy. He didn't look up from the specimen tray he was meticulously labeling. Just the same song and dance, I muttered, my gaze fixed on the victim. Her eyes, wide and unseeing, seemed to stare past me, past the sterile room, into some unimaginable abyss. This wasn't just a copycat. This was a direct message. A challenge. I knelt by the body, my gloved fingers hovering inches above the skin. The lividity was setting in, a purplish bloom spreading across her back. Time of death, roughly between midnight and 4 a.m. Standard. But the details, the tiny scratch marks on her left wrist, almost invisible unless you were looking for them, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her right eyelid even in death. The things only I would notice. The things he knew I would notice. The ligature marks, I said, my voice low. Pressure points. They're consistent with the Miller case, but there's a variation, a slight shift in angle on the left side, almost like he's trying to show me he's learned. The technician grunted, a sound of weary acknowledgement. He'd seen enough of my obsessions to know when I was sinking my teeth into something. I moved to the other side of the table, my eyes scanning the periphery. The room was sparsely furnished. Stainless steel tables, a cart with instruments, a drain in the center of the floor, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet I felt a prickle of unease, a sensation of being watched. I glanced at the ventilation grate near the ceiling, then at the heavy metal door that led back to the main corridors. Solid, secure, but the feeling persisted. It was like the phantom itch of a lost limb, a reminder of what wasn't there. This was the same, only amplified. Did you find anything on the entry point? I asked, my gaze sweeping over the technician's notes. No signs of forced entry into the hospital. Security logs are clean. He was brought in by ambulance, reported found at her apartment by a neighbor. He paused, then added, the attending paramedics noted nothing unusual about the scene at her apartment. Said it looked like she'd just fallen asleep. Fallen asleep. The irony was a bitter pill. The Miller killer had been meticulous, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that led nowhere. This one was doing the same, only the breadcrumbs were leading directly to me. A faint scent drifted on the air, barely perceptible beneath the antiseptic. Lilac, not lavender. A subtle shift, but significant. Miller had been lavender. This was, what? A new phase, a progression, or a deliberate misdirection? My mind raced, sifting through old case files, cross-referencing victimology, anything. Nothing fit. Suddenly, a low, thrumming sound vibrated through the floor. It wasn't the hum of the lights. It was deeper, more resonant. The technicians exchanged a look, their practiced composure wavering for the first time. What was that? One of them asked, his voice tight. Generator kicking in, maybe, the other suggested, though his eyes were wide. I didn't answer. The thrumming intensified, a low growl that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the building. And then, a flicker. The fluorescent lights above me dimmed, then surged back to full, harsh brightness. My heart gave a lurch, a physical jolt that had nothing to do with exertion. It was the sound, not the generator. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged, something metallic, and it was coming from below. Stay here, I ordered, my voice sharper than I intended. I drew my sidearm, the familiar weight a small comfort in my hand. The technicians nodded, their faces pale. They knew this wasn't routine. I moved towards the far wall where a heavy, bolted steel door stood, marked with a faded, restricted access sign. The dragging sound was loudest here. I placed my ear against the cold metal. Then another scrape, closer this time. My breath hitched. This was it. The taunt wasn't just in the staging. It was in the timing. He'd waited for me, waited for the autopsy. Waited for the moment I was most vulnerable, most engrossed in the past. I looked back at the technicians, their faces etched with a fear I recognized all too well. Call for backup, I replied, my voice a low growl. Tell them the killer is here, in the basement. I didn't wait for their confirmation. My gaze was fixed on the steel door. The scraping had stopped. A moment of absolute silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Then a single, sharp rap. 3 times, the Miller killer's signature. He wasn't just mimicking, he was heralding, and he was waiting for me to open the door. The silence that followed the rap was a heavy blanket. I could feel the weight of it pressing down, even through the sterile air of the hospital basement. Emergency autopsy requested. My colleagues were a blur of hushed whispers and the clatter of equipment behind me. I didn't hear them. My focus was on the reinforced steel door, the same kind of door that had sealed off so many unanswered questions in my past. 3 sharp raps. The Miller killer. It was undeniable. The echo of those past cases, the ones that had gnawed at me for years, slammed into me with renewed force. This was him, or at least someone who knew him. A faint click broke the stillness. The door swung inward, revealing not a figure, but a small metallic object placed precisely in the center of the threshold. I approached cautiously, my gloved hand hovering over it. It was a tarnished silver locket, intricately engraved with a familiar pattern. The same pattern I'd found etched into the floorboards of the first victim's apartment all those years ago. My stomach tightened. This was more than a taunt. It was a confession. A direct line drawn from the past to the present, with me standing squarely in the middle. I picked up the locket. Inside, nestled against faded velvet, was a miniature photograph. A young woman, her eyes bright and full of life. I recognized her instantly, the first victim, the one I'd promised myself I'd find justice for. Dean, the voice of the precinct captain laced with concern, finally cut through my reverie. I turned, the locket clutched in my palm. He's playing with us, I answered, my voice rough. He wants us to know he knows. The captain stepped closer, his gaze flicking from the locket to my face. Who, Dean? Who are we talking about? The Miller killer, it's him, or someone who's been studying him. Every detail, every ritual, this locket. It's a breadcrumb. He's leading us somewhere. We spent the next few hours combing through the data, cross-referencing every detail of the Miller case with the recent string of murders. It was a macabre dance choreographed by a phantom. There's a disconnect, a younger detective, usually so eager, said, rubbing his temples. The MO is perfect, but the victims, they don't fit the Miller profile. These people are random, no apparent connection to each other or to the original victims. That's the point, I responded, my mind racing. He's not just recreating the murders, he's evolving. He's using Miller as a template, but he's adding his own. signature, and he's doing it to get my attention. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. My failures, my unsolved cases, they were the foundation of this killer's game. He wasn't just a murderer, he was a hunter, and I was his prey. Then, a small detail, overlooked in the initial sweep of the most recent crime scene, caught my eye. A faint scuff mark on the wall near the ceiling, almost invisible. It was a different color than the paint, a greasy residue. I remembered seeing something similar years ago in a derelict warehouse on the docks, a place I'd dismissed as a dead end. The warehouse, I breathed, a sudden surge of adrenaline coursing through me. The original Miller crimes. I think he was using a staging area, somewhere he could prepare. The warehouse loomed out of the pre-dawn mist, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised sky. It was just as I remembered it, decaying and forgotten. The air inside was heavy with the smell of damp concrete and something metallic, something that made my skin crawl. We moved systematically, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beams, disturbed for the first time in years. Then we found it. A section of the floor, cleaner than the rest, with faint scratches that matched the ones on the locket. And beside it, a small, crudely drawn map. A map of the city with one location circled in red, the hospital, specifically the older, abandoned wing. My heart hammered against my ribs, but it wasn't the frantic beat of fear. It was the steady rhythm of purpose. He had led us here. He wanted us to find him. It was a labyrinth of peeling paint and decaying medical equipment. Then we heard it. A low, guttural humming. We found him in the old operating theater. He was hunched over a table, illuminated by a single, flickering bulb. He wasn't the phantom I'd imagined. He was just a man, gaunt and pale, his eyes wide and unfocused, and on the table before him, it wasn't a victim. It was a meticulously constructed diorama, a miniature replica of the first Miller crime scene. I always did care about the details, Dean. He didn't resist. He didn't fight. He simply stood, his hands raised, his gaze fixed on me. As they cuffed him, his eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw not madness but a profound, desperate loneliness. Later, back at the precinct, the paperwork was a blur. The killer, a former medical student with a twisted obsession with unsolved crimes, had been apprehended. He confessed everything, his motive a desperate attempt to finish the Miller case, to prove he could solve what I couldn't. The locket, the diorama, the elaborate staging, it was all a performance, designed to draw me in, to force me to confront my own ghosts. And in a way, he had succeeded. The Miller case was finally closed. The specter that had haunted me for so long had been laid to rest. The jadedness was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was tempered by something new, a fragile sense of peace. The city was safe. Justice, however delayed, had been served. And I, for the first time in a long time, could finally breathe. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer defined me. I had faced my failures, and I had walked away, not unscathed, but whole,